Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is Scott Keith, and we're talking about his new book, Being Dad, Father as a Picture of God's Grace, which is published by New Reformation Press. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate your time.
Well, Scott, first off, let's help the audience get to know you a bit better. If I bumped into you in a coffee shop and asked you to tell me about your family, who you are, and what you do for a living, how might you respond to that?
I always say that I'm first and foremost a husband and a father. I've been married for 21 years to my lovely wife, Joy. We have 3 kids, Caleb, Joshua, and Autumn, and just last year, a great daughter-in-law, Erica. So that's, I think, on the whole, that takes up most of my at least mental time and energy, and it's what I've always wanted to do, and I love it. But I also work at Concordia University in Irvine, where I serve as the Associate Dean of Students, and I also an instructor in theology in our Christ College, which is our theology department, where I teach basically classes in basic theology.
All right. Well, thanks for helping us get to know you and your family a little better and telling us a little bit about what you do. One thing I picked up on, I don't remember if this was in the book or one of the articles I read about you online, but I think we can relate probably in our early stories. I mean, I grew up in a single-parent home without a dad around, and it sounds like that was an experience you had too. I'm going to guess that really impacts where you go in the book, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I tell the story in the book that my dad died when I was 2 years old. I actually have no memories of him at all. And so my life, I was raised by a great mother. And then after my dad died, we moved closer to her family, and so her parents were also involved, especially my grandmother. It was a great upbringing. I mean, I really have no complaints other than the fact that I always felt the need for a father that wasn't there. And I'd say it's produced in me the desire to want to fill that need in somebody else someday. And from as early as I can remember, the one thing I wanted to be was a dad. So the writing of the book, in a lot of ways, came out of that, came out of some of the influences of my mentor, Rod Rosenblatt, and some other male mentors that I eventually was lucky enough to have taken me under their wing along the way. But yeah, I, in essence, was raised by my mother and a grandmother. Sometimes input of, I'd say, an emotionally distant grandfather, but he died when I was fairly young as well. But yeah, that's the story, as it were.
Yeah, it is interesting when you grow up under those circumstances. I mean, I think for me too, being a father of soon to be 9 kids, it was just something I really wanted to understand. I have a real heart and a burden for being able to be for my kids what my dad was never able to be for me growing up. So definitely don't always understand it at the beginning. You got a lot to learn because it wasn't necessarily modeled in the home, but something that sounds like both of us have a real passion and heart for.
I would say that's true. I don't think I understood it really. Even, in fact, I can say that I used to say it all the time when I was a teenager. Hey, I just want to be a dad, and it used to really freak my mom out. Thinking that as a 16-year-old walking around saying he just wants to be a dad, that the inevitable might happen. But that wasn't it really. I wasn't really looking for, the negative sides of that as a teenager. What I was looking for was to have an impact on people in a strong, sort of gracious male way. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up working with kids from a very young age. I worked at our Parks and Recreation department when I was in high school. I worked at several of the pools. Had been a camp director since I was 15. Ended up working at camps full time after graduating from high school. And so it became, a way for me to have a bunch of surrogate children. And I wanted to say too, I can't tell you how impressed I am that you guys have 9 kids. Wow, your wife, bless her and keep her.
Yes, I plan to keep her around. Hopefully she plans to keep me around too. So for you, I mean, was there, obviously this is a message you have a burden for, but there always seems to be with a lot of authors and projects where there's kind of a story behind the book, sort of an aha moment or an experience where the idea for or the need to write a book suddenly just happened all of a sudden. Was there an experience for you where you're like, oh man, this is the book I need to write?
I'd say it this way, is when I first came, so when my wife and I married, we lived in Chicago. We had our first son, Caleb, I'd say, about 11 months after we were married. And so we jumped right into it, right? And very near after that, we left Chicago to come to Concordia University, Irvine, because I was going to finish my bachelor's degree in theology, and I specifically had heard Dr. Rod Rosenblatt on the radio and wanted to come study under him. So we came out to Concordia University, and in the classes that I had with Dr. Rosenblatt, he conveyed this message. I mean, they were theology classes and philosophy classes, but he continually conveyed this message of how important it is to have fathers in the home and strong men in the home. But the way he conveyed what it meant to be a strong man was nothing like I'd ever heard before. Even though I didn't have a father myself growing up, all my friends did, and I always found it interesting that none of my friends liked their fathers. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that their fathers were sort of the typical wait till your father gets home kind of dads, that they would come home and they'd be the arms of discipline to mom's voice of discipline. And it sort of just worked out that way. So even that wasn't necessarily the father that I wanted to be, but it was the only visual pictures of father that I had. And when I got to Concordia and heard Dr. Rosenblatt speak of fathers, it was completely different. It was a father who rescues from sort of the everyday things in life where the law bears down on us and where conviction is always upon us. It was almost exactly the opposite of what I had seen all the time. And I actually, at that point, wasn't thinking myself about writing the book, but I thought he should. And that just never happened. But I can say so I had a 1-year-old at the time, and then by the time I was done studying with him, we had our second son, Joshua. And so I was a father, and he shaped my view of what it means and what my kids needed from me. They didn't need bigger biceps and a deeper voice and somebody to scare them when they were sick of listening to mom all day. They needed somebody that was a picture of God's grace to them in the home, a picture of God's forgiveness in the home, a mouthpiece of his forgiveness in the home. And as time went by and I continued to ruminate on these things that I had learned from Dr. Rosenblatt, and he still hadn't done a published work on it, I began to think, well, somebody needs to publish this. And I can then say that I really have been thinking about writing this book for probably 15 or 16 years.
Wow, so a message you've certainly had a lot of time to think about.
Yeah, well, there's also nobody wants to write, so in my mind this isn't a how-to book, but I think inevitably parts of it will be viewed that way. And so I also wanted to wait until my kids were a little bit older to see if it worked, I guess. I had every confidence in the world that it would. I'd say it that way. I had every confidence in the world that it would work, but I wanted to be able to point to them and say, we'll see, it did. So.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. You know, with part of the work I do in the publishing industry, I do help decide on what new books we're going to publish and some different things like that. And when I see these book proposals from these young parents, you know, where all their children are under 5 or that sort of thing, and they want to write this book as a parenting expert, my gut reaction is, could you maybe write that in 10 years or 15 years after you've graduated one or you've kind of gone through all the stages? Because you may not all have it figured out with your 2 kids under 5.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because several years ago, I won't use a name or anything, but I came across a video blog by a prominent person in our circles, and it was on what to teach your teenage children about dating. And at the time, my oldest son was 16, which means my second son was 14, and my daughter was 12. And so they're all sort of coming into this period of time when it becomes, according at least to our culture, socially acceptable to start to date. And I remember looking at this video from this man, and he had such a hard stance on it, that, you know, not even holding hands is acceptable, and this is what you teach them from the time that they come up. And whether you agree with that or disagree with it, what struck me is that he did have 4 children, but they were all under 5. And I thought, okay, so how do you assist a parent who's in the midst of having these conversations with their 16, 14, and 12-year-old? Because just telling them that nothing is permissible seems untenable to me. And so I had that same reaction, and that's part of why I wanted to wait, is just to see that, you know, these ideas, and I have every confidence in them because I think they're scriptural, number one, but 2, I'd like to have something empirical to point at.
Yeah, it's
over there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very similar to what we talk about in marketing circles. You know, there's a million books and a million blogs and courses where people are like, I will help you increase your blog traffic to this, or I'll help you that. And it's like, if the person who's offering you this advice or this product hasn't actually done that themselves, then they're probably not the best expert to give you advice or coaching. So definitely some wisdom on your part to wait until you were a little bit further down, or you might say accomplished on your fatherhood journey.
Yeah, I couldn't be prouder of my children. I mean, they've had all of the same problems that most children do, but at the end of the day, they're people who are steeped in God's Word. They appreciate learning and academics, and they love their parents, and they love each other. And so it's, I don't know, I think it worked, perhaps.
Sure. Well, getting back to a bit of what we talked about earlier, on the one hand, you could look at somebody like me or somebody like you who didn't necessarily have a father in the home or had a distant father that was in the home, where things weren't necessarily modeled for us. So there wasn't a lot for us to go on when it came to role of the father or masculinity. What does that look like in a marriage? What does that look like in a family? I think we get very mixed messages from whether it be TV, media, all the things that we see out in culture. And you've already answered the question I was planning to ask about what does the role of a father look like? But what about masculinity? What is godly masculinity, biblical masculinity, if we want to put that around it? What might that look like?
In the book, I use the model of the father and the prodigal son. In fact, as far as stories go, I can't think of a story that tells the tale of a father where a more masculine man is presented. And he's, like many things in the scriptures, where it seems foolishness to our culture, he's the exact opposite of what we might consider masculine if we were to look to society for the answer. He's quiet, he's gracious, he's understated, he has a strong presence, and you can see the strong presence by the fact that everybody comes to him to ask the question, to get the answer to the question. The younger son, even though it's a horrible question he's asking of him, act like you're dead and give me half of what's yours and make it mine. And even the older son comes and has questions, and the only answer the father can have. But his response is never as a blowhard. His response is never, you'll listen to me right now or else. It's never threatening. It's kind, it's gracious, and it's strength. The strength of a man is in a man's graciousness. The strength of a man is in his proclamation of forgiveness. The setting free takes more of a man's strength than does the binding. And I think a masculine man realizes that. It doesn't operate out of fear, but operates out of trust, and that trust that only comes on account of what we've received in the Word, on account of Christ. But they know that. They know that there's nothing to fear because God has it in His hands. He's made promises to us, and therefore we act out of the strength of God's promises rather than trying to rely on our own strength and bolstering that strength in some sort of artificial way. I think that a masculine man is masculine because he's confident that his God loves and cares for him on account of Christ and can in turn share that confidence with his family.
Well, I would be hard-pressed to come up with a better example from the Bible. I often have heard the prodigal son parable referred to in this regard as a good example of fatherhood, or masculinity, I guess was really what we were talking about. And one of the things that's always struck me about that parable, the idea of the patriarch of the family running on the road to meet this, the wayward son. In that culture, it would have been seen as not respectful for the patriarch to hoist up his robes a little bit and run down that road and just...
it seemed hurried, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. It's just throwing all caution to the wind and running to embrace that son really shows the heart of the father that was willing to put aside the cultural norms and expectations just to receive and love his son.
I think of, every time I hear it, I get goosebumps while he was yet a long way off. The father saw him. I always get the picture in my mind that in order for that to happen, he had to sort of be perched somewhere waiting and watching, probably somewhere high. And you can imagine the ridicule that must have been heaped upon this, if in the story, the idea that he would have been ridiculed daily for wasting his days sitting on some perch waiting for this person who wished him only death to return. It's a powerful picture of how deep our state is in sin and how deep the Father's love for us is. It's a wonderful parable, wonderful story.
Whether we're talking about, men and their children or God and us, it seems when you start to dwell on that, there was almost an expectancy that the Father knew the Son would return eventually, and he was just waiting.
Yeah, that's interesting. And because the Father trusts, right? The Father's not, in a weird way that we don't understand, the Father is not afraid of freedom, if that makes any sense. The way in which that freedom came about, the demands that the younger son placed on the Father, even the Father's capitulation even seems just completely foreign to us. But the Father at the same time, I think, knew the road that such extreme freedom would take the younger son down, but also knew that the return was imminent. It's kind of cliche to say, but that the Father's love always points the children home. There's always a safe place here, no matter what. There's a safe place here, and that safe place is in his arms.
On the one hand, when we're growing up, we have influences that contribute to our pictures of fatherhood and masculinity and what that looks like with all the different hats that we as men tend to wear. But I think once we get to adulthood, we get married, we have children, and we're in the midst of things. One of the things that is often missing for men today, what I would call, deep friendships, being in healthy community with other men where we're going to challenge and encourage each other and spur each other on to better things, especially within our families and such. Talk to us a bit about the importance of these sorts of friendships in our adult life. And I believe one of the things you talk about at one point in the book is the idea of philia, the love that binds men together. What might that look like, and how should that be positively contributing into our roles as men and the different hats we're wearing?
Yeah, I think we need to spend time together. I just finished reading Alistair McGrath's biography of C.S. Lewis, and it's interesting the role that the Inklings played to that group of men. I often, as I've heard the story of the Inklings before, they always met at the Eagle and Child, and they would go over one of them were writing at the time. Tolkien would bring a chapter from Lord of the Rings. Lewis would bring whatever he's currently working on, and they'd sort of go through it. But as I read the book, it became clear that there were two Inklings meetings every week. There was the official meeting to go through the work and to be this official literary group, and then there was a second meeting with just time to come together and to have a few pints of beer and to talk and to be men together, to laugh, to encourage one another, to be in that community of faith. In our Lutheran Confessions, there's a section in the small called articles where Luther talks about the mutual conversation and consolation of the brethren. And he discusses it in terms of it's quasi-sacramental when we come together with one another and we support each other in this daily grind that we're in, where the world, as Luther would say, the devil, the world, and our own sinful flesh press down upon us every day and try to turn us away from that grace that we have received on account of Christ, and try to turn us away from reflecting that grace on other people, especially our family, especially our children. And we need, specifically men, we need to be in the company of other men who are gracious and masculine in that same sort of Christ-centered way, to encourage one another, to forgive one another, to absolve one another, to set each other free so that we can go back into that daily grind, face the devil, the world, and our own sinful flesh with the forgiveness we've received in Christ so that we can mirror that forgiveness back to the people God has placed in our lives. We need it, and we've lost it. Even I believe he's a not believer, Robert Bly, the American poet Robert Bly, saw this in the early and late 90s in his Gatherings of Men, and writes it in Iron John, that this is something that's lost, and the men in America, and probably in the world for that matter, are facing a deep emotional, psychological, and spiritual loss in their lives because they don't have the company of other men. We have to get it back. We have to get it back if men are to see themselves, their masculinity, in a way that's not trumped up and superficial, and instead see it in a way where they're actually free to be what God has already declared they are, which is His children, free in Him, free to share that forgiveness with others.
One of the things that I've learned, as I've gotten older, I'm a couple of years away from 40 here, and one of the things I've realized is, on the one hand, I need to be in relationship with my peers, people that are in my similar age group, but I also know that I need to be in relationship with older men who are 10, 15, 20 years or more further down the path than me, who've had a lot more life experience, professionally, as fathers, as husbands, serving in the church. And then also, I need to be speaking into those men that are younger than me too, people that I can share from my experiences and encourage and mentor them. So I think it's important that as men, we seek out a range of friendships with people from a range of different age groups.
Absolutely. And again, you're singing Robert Bly's song here. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those YouTube videos on
No, I
Gathering
haven't.
of Men. You should look them up. And the book is Iron. I'm selling other people's book here, but the book is Iron John. He was raised Lutheran pietist, I believe, and I'm not sure where he is. I think we should pray for him, in other words. But the reality is that he points that out. In those gatherings, he says, okay, if you are a younger man who's had the influence of an older mentor, raise your hand. And they do. And then to the older men in the room, he says, if you've been an influence, the younger men shake his hand. And he says, and if you haven't, find one. And I think find a younger man to influence. And I cannot tell you the impact that people like Rod Rosenblatt and my doctor father, Jim Nestigan, have had in my life. In fact, I write the book for them because they are older men who decided to be more than professors to me. They decided to be mentors, they decided to be friends, and ultimately they decided to be surrogate father figures to me. And the change that they've made in my life has caused me to want to go out and do that, not only for my own children, but for other people who haven't had this role in their life, either from a father, a grandfather, an uncle, or a friend, to find them. Last year here at Concordia, we had a little men's group where I would take male students out on Wednesday nights, and we'd read through Robert Bly and other works having to do with what does it mean to be a man? What are some of the steps along the way? And it was incredibly popular, and it was incredibly encouraging to them and to me, because I need to know, too, that there's usefulness here, right? As we sort of write this stuff and we think about it and we talk about it, when young men glean onto that, we can see in them the spark that we once saw in ourselves. And we can see that, this message of graciousness and forgiveness and a masculinity that's kind and that focuses on treating women with dignity and respect and not as objects. I cannot tell you how much of a problem that is in our society today at colleges. I work as a student conduct officer at the university, and the things that go on right now simply because men don't have a view of women where they're seen as God's children, as God's creation, as fellow people, as people worthy of care, not just illicit desire. It's important, and we need to do more of it. So if you are an older man, I'll say along with Robert Bly, find a younger man and be his mentor, be his friend, and you'll find that you'll probably end up being a surrogate father figure to him too.
Well, and I'll just say, praise God for those older men who, are willing to speak into our lives. I had some dads of friends, really, as I was growing up, that they basically grafted me into their families, you could say, and just heavily influenced the man I've become today, character development, learning how to work hard, and just different things that just left to my own, I wouldn't have had a chance to develop. But even though it was informal, being under their headship, their mentorship in the ways that I was able to be really just had a massive, massive impact on who I am today. So always praising God for those men, as I'm sure you do for those men that drastically impacted your life.
A lot of mine came through going up to summer camp, and the men there that would take you under their wing and just really, especially when I started working up there, just really show you the value of hard work, of honesty, of character, and that meant something different than what I was being told every day out in the world.
So thinking of fatherhood struggles, masculinity struggles, is there a difference outside the church versus what we're seeing inside the church? Like, are the struggles the same, or is there some variation there?
My opinion is probably a little bleak, and I'm sorry to say that, but I think on most of these issues, the church has just co-opted society's view and baptized it. And I don't know why that is. We've seen a little bit of pushback in the church, I think. Some people have written that some of this needs to change, but it seems to me like every month I see a new article on why men are leaving the church. And it all has to do basically with the feminization of the culture within the church. And I think that's the same reason why men are choosing not to be fathers, and men are choosing not to even stay fathers after they become fathers. To leave the care of their children to someone else is because the whole thing has been feminized. And I'm not saying that in the way that feminists are the cause. I think men are the cause. I think that men have given up their role in the home. And even, I know me. I know that if my wife lets my contribution in the house be that I sit on the couch and drink a beer and watch TV, I'll be happy for that to be my contribution in the house, because I'm kind of, the path of least resistance is sometimes what's open, what looks the best to me. And I think that's the case for a lot of men, that if our expectation of them in the church or even in society or in the church is that they do nothing, that if they do something, they're either going to be the bumbling idiot or the man with bigger muscles who just comes in and oppress, those are the things that they'll live up to. And that is the message from culture, that the men in the home, they're bumbling idiots, you can't leave the kids with them or the house will be destroyed, or that they're not in the house at all, and that's fine because I can handle it on my own, says the woman. Or if they are in the house, you have one job, and that's just to back me up with your muscles when you get home. And I think to myself, that's not the picture I see. That's not the picture that was fed to me. That's not the picture I see as presented to us in Scripture. I see something else. I see a father in the home who's the head of the house, and not in an oppressive way, but in a gracious way. Stealing from G.K. Chesterton, I say that the man is the head in the house because the head is where the mouth is, and the man is called to be the mouthpiece of forgiveness to the home, the mouthpiece of absolution to the home, mouthpiece of kindness and graciousness to the home. And even when it's required to be the mouthpiece of the law in the home, that's still the head because that's where the proclamation comes from. And so it's not an oppressive thing. It's the exact opposite. It's because he is supposed to be the one taking on the burden that forgiveness requires. It's not that he's permissive, that he doesn't see the wrongdoing of his children. He doesn't see the state of his home as it needs fixing. It's that his response to what he sees is not oppressive, but rather it's forgiving. Forgiveness doesn't look past wrongdoing. And I think that's often mistaken. In order to be forgiven, someone must first know that they need forgiveness. In order to be forgiven, to proclaim forgiveness, you must first have seen that the person you're forgiving has done something atrocious. That's what the Father does. He steps in. He makes it okay, not in a permissive way, but in a gracious way.
Well, I think that's something men will especially come to realize as we get older, when we have our family, when we, become managers of people or lead or, work with other people, you learn very quickly that people will often rise to the level of expectation you put on them. And so that's where I think the being in community with other men who are going to challenge us and encourage us and push us is so vitally important, because sometimes we need people to remind us, for lack of a better way to say it, sometimes we need to be reminded to step it up, because I think, like you said, there's a lot of us that are as just content to do what we need to do within the home, but we're just as happy to sit on the couch and drink a beer as opposed to maybe get up and go help. We could take either one, And so we really do need people, and I would say people outside of our spouse and outside of our family to be pushing us to take it to that next level, because left to our own devices, sometimes we're just content to hang out.
And we're content to, even if our spouse is the only one pushing us to be more, we're content often to be upset with our spouse for doing the pushing. Whereas I guess I'd say our brothers, our outside group of men encouraging one another, we often see that differently, right? If our friend tells us, hey, brother, you need to step it up, we see that much differently than if our wife tells us that.
Certainly.
Although we should be willing to hear it from her, it's just harder because it's closer to home.
Yeah, well, and I think we can often make the excuse, well, she's just being a nagging wife today, versus when our friend points out the same thing, we're like, oh, now I feel a little bit of ashamed about that, versus before we're just willing to push it off.
And we also need our friends to forgive us when we fail. I mean, that's so important. I say that, I try to say it multiple times in the book, that I present here an ideal that I don't reach, and it's one that I ask for forgiveness for daily. Forgiveness for those times when I've taken the easy way out, forgiveness for those times when I've been oppressive and not the bearer of freedom in Christ, forgiveness for those times when I've yelled, when I've screamed, when I should have done the exact opposite. I need to both point it out and I need it absolved. And that's the one thing that a group of men with one another can do.
And that's why I think it is important to have an ideal, in the sense of it gives us a direction to be moving. It gives us something to be striving for. But like you say, we're not necessarily going to always be hitting 100%. We're not always going to make the mark. But that is why it's an ideal, because it's something that might be perfectly unattainable, but it's the direction we need to keep pushing towards.
Correct.
Well, to start winding down, when you think of men reading the book, finishing that last page and shutting it, what's your hope? What's your prayer? How would you like to see their lives impacted or begin to change as they're reading and once they finish the book? Like, what's the call to action you have for men today when it comes to their roles in the home, fatherhood, being a husband, that sort of thing?
I hope as they turn the last page to shut the book that that one of two things has happened. That they've encountered an idea of a man, and a man, specifically a man in the home, the dad, the father, that resets their thinking, that it's taken them from a point where they thought that they were just supposed to be the voice of the law, who's bigger and stronger and louder, to understanding that they're the mouthpiece of forgiveness and a reflection of God's grace, or that they found encouragement for those same reasons. The book is full of stories of men who have either been that grace to their children in the home, that reflection of God's grace, or that they've received that reflection of God's grace from another man, and that those stories be encouraging and they be uplifting, or that they be something that resets the focus, or that they've just enjoyed a couple of good stories about good fathers and been encouraged that and they are out there. They are out there. We've managed to find some of their stories and put them in the book.
Well, I think of one of the things my pastor says is that he talks about, and specifically in relation to marriage, he recommends that all of us in the church read a good book about marriage at least once a year, just to get us thinking about striving for that next thing, being better, improving. And I would say the same thing about fatherhood. We should probably be seeking out a good book, and I would say your book is a good book on fatherhood to give us encouragement, give us new ideas, and just keep helping us to renew our mind and thinking that we need to keep moving towards that ideal and trying to become more of the men that God would have us be in our homes. Well, Scott, if the listeners are interested in connecting with you, finding out more about your book, that sort of thing, where are some of the places they can connect with you on the web?
I write for 1517legacy.com. I'm also involved with that organization in a leadership role. My book is available at the web store over there at 1517legacy.com. And I also write a weekly blog for thejaggedword.com. I think I come on Mondays now, and we have many authors over there. I'm just one of the several authors, but I do write on Mondays over at the Jagged Word. But all of that, actually Jagged Word as well, all of that can be found if it's just make it simple to go to 1517legacy.com.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to put links in the show notes. Once you can find out where to buy Scott's book. Also, we'll include links to the Jagged Word, 1517legacy.com. So just head on over to shauntabatt.com, and we'll have that there for you. You can just click right through. And it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Scott Keith, talking about his new book, Being Dad, Father is a Picture of God's Grace. For more on the book, you should go to the publisher's website, which again, you'll be able to find that at 1517legacy.com. And Scott, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you as well. Thank you for your time.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.